Hiya mates, and welcome to our second lesson of the week where we will be exploring evil and eccentricity. So this is the introduction to our new unit in English. Now before we start, I'm going to ask you to do a review of your learning, and this is a bit of a trickier mastery review task. So you have 5 questions to write down the answers to, and they are asking you today to recap learning from all the way back to the beginning of the year and back in September. So number 1, I'd like you to think about which characters that we've studied may be described as virtuous. Number 2, can you explain how and why English language has changed over time? Number 3, what do we mean by the term democracy? Number 4, which characters we've encountered might be described as evil and why? And number 5, can you list the 3 components of the Aristotelian triad? Pause the video and see how many of those you can answer from memory now. Okay, well done. If you managed to put something down for each of the 5 questions there, it's really tricky, isn't it? Trying to think all the way back to the different units that we've studied and some of the big ideas that we've covered. Now, it's important that we recap these things because they are those key bits of knowledge that we want you to take forward into any new topic. So let's go through the answers and you can check them against your own and you can add in the answers for any that you got incorrect or missed out. And don't worry if you couldn't answer them all. It's perfectly fine for us to have forgotten certain things and need to recap them. Okay, so which characters could be described as virtuous? Well, that takes me really back to our unit around language change and Chaucer. And we remember we read the Canterbury Tales. I would say the best example of virtue and a virtuous character was the knight. But we might have also considered the prioress, who exemplified some of those qualities that maybe have been expected of women in that period. Number 2 then, language change over time. There's lots of things you may have written for this, so please don't worry if your answer doesn't look identical to mine. But I've said that language change has evolved with the addition of new words. We've seen new spellings, even changes to syntax, so the order of sentences. And it's changed for lots of reasons, but including the arrival of different tribes into England, migration and travel. So we have those loan words and words borrowed from different languages, such as French, for example, as well as new words that are created to describe things that didn't exist before. So new technologies and inventions really help to change our language. For number 3, so these are characters that might be, or people that might have been considered as evil. Well, I've picked the first one as the miller. Now, perhaps we would say his character is more sinful, has embodiment of vice, for example. We might have had Bill Sikes. If you were looking at the Charles Dickens unit, you may have picked him out as a violent criminal, somebody whose behaviours might be described as evil. If we were looking at Animal Farm, I know some of us have studied it already, we might have looked at a character such as Napoleon, perhaps in his kind of totalitarian rule, his tyrannical leadership. As well as the speaker, of course, in the story that you read, The Telltale Heart, we see his madness, leading him to murder. Number 4 then, that was the word democracy. So democracy is all about people power. So a system of government where the whole population is governed by elected representatives. So in a democracy, we would have the right to vote who we want to be leading us in our government. And finally, number 5, the 3 parts there of the Aristotelian triad were ethos, logos, and pathos. And a bonus point to you if you can give a short definition for each one and what those terms stand for. Okay, so you can see there lots of recapping going right the way back to prior knowledge, and remembering that it's always really important for any new text that we study. So today then we are looking at this new topic. We've been discussing it for a couple of lessons now, ideas of explorations in evil and eccentricity. So let me give you a little snapshot of what we'll be learning. And really the big idea behind this unit is that writers are really skilled at exploring what it means to be a human being, exploring the human condition, as well as the darker sides of human nature. So throughout this unit, we'll be learning about things such as Britain's most infamous murderer. We'll be looking at some really popular genres of the 19th century, such as the Gothic genre. We'll be looking at a range of texts, including Sherlock Holmes. We'll be looking at one of the most popular detectives of the period, as well as other interesting characters, such as Mr. Hyde and the Mad Hatter. We'll be looking at the dubious popularity of the freak show in Victorian society, as well as some wonderful narrative poetry that was really popular at the time too. So this is a really varied and interesting unit. Okay, the first thing we need to do then is to build some of our contextual knowledge. So that means we need to get our pens ready to write down a definition of this term. So we're going to be talking a lot in this unit about the human condition. So the human condition are the characteristics, the key events and situations which really compose the essentials of human existence. As I mentioned before, what it means to be human, what makes us unique, and what makes our experiences perhaps sometimes universal between us. So we'll be looking at birth and growth, our emotions, our aspirations and hopes, as well as conflict and mortality and death. So this is a really important term to note down. So pause here and just write down the term and a brief definition. Okay. So we're going to begin to explore how writers present the human condition by looking at texts that are from or are set in the 19th century. So it's important that we look at context first and we get an insight into what life was like at this time. So we'll be asking this question over a couple of lessons. What was life like for the poor in Victorian Britain? Now, I know you already have some prior knowledge of this from your unit where you studied Charles Dickens, his world and his writing. But let's do a bit of a recap first. When we're looking at the 19th century, we're going to be looking at it as a time with a large amount of social change. It was at this time that slavery was abolished, and there was also a massive urbanisation and industrialisation. So that meant that it led to much higher levels of productivity, of profit and prosperity. But it was also a time of conflicting ideas. It was a time of invention and growth, but also one of poverty and of cruelty. You might want to think at this stage what you already know about the kinds of inventions that came out throughout the 19th century. And on the other side of that, what do you know that means that this was a time of poverty and cruelty? What kinds of things do you know happened, or do you know about the laws or what people were forced to do? It's a good opportunity now just to review what you've already learned. As I've mentioned, in Year 7, you learned about Charles Dickens and how he was a famous 19th century writer. But what kinds of things did he write about? What was he interested in teaching people? And what did he see were flaws in society? I want you to pause the video here and spend 5 minutes reviewing what you already know about Charles Dickens. See if you can complete all or some of the sentence stems. Pause the video and have a go now. Okay, really well done if you managed to complete all 3 sentence stems here. Again, it's a tricky task because we're having to recall from memory things that we've learned quite a long time ago. What I'm going to do now is go through some example sentences with you. They may be similar or different to your own, and that's okay. And if there were any that you couldn't get, can I ask you to copy them down? So I've written here that Charles Dickens not only presents the social inequality of Victorian Britain, but also advocates for a fairer society. Because Dickens saw the dehumanising effects of industrialisation, he exposed the reality of the conditions people faced in his writing. Despite some people believing that the poor were unimportant, Dickens denounced the workhouses, exposing the gratuitous cruelty and the greed of those involved in the system. So we can see here that Dickens is being presented as this advocate for social justice and for social change. He wanted to expose and speak out against the things that he saw created unfairness and inequality. Pause the video and add to your sentences now, please. Okay, so I'm hoping at this point we've had a good opportunity to really start thinking back about what we already know. Let's build on that now with a few further notes. I'm going to discuss and then I'll get you to pause and add a couple of extra details down. So the Industrial Revolution. Well, for hundreds of years, there were very little change in the technologies used in Europe. People really lived and worked with simple, basic tools that their ancestors had used. People used candles to light their homes. It was animals such as horses that were used for transportation. And craftsmen would use their skills to make hand-constructed goods. In the mid-1700s, life really began to change in Europe, and this is where we see the Industrial Revolution beginning. We see it as a time of revolution of inventiveness, and the age of the machine has begun. So some of the significant inventions of this time include things that we still rely on in our lives today. So in 1800, we have the invention of the electric battery. And in, let's have a look, 1876, look, the invention of the telephone. By 1889, we have cars, the automobile. So as well as this being an exciting time of discovery and of progress, it's also quite a worrying time. Many people felt that these advances in science and technology could have negative influences on our lives, that they might lead to corruption and that they might be damaging and harmful to nature. Okay, so before we move on, I just want you to make a couple of notes here. Tell me at least two things that were invented and why people might have had concerns about this. Pause the video and add to your notes. Okay, so now is our time to do a bit of active reading together. As I've said before, in order to gain a better insight into what life was like in Victorian Britain, we need to read some texts that were written in or about that period in time. So we're going to start with an extract from a book called The Five. The extract we'll read is taken from the beginning of the book, where Reuben Holt describes the rich and poor divide in Victorian Britain, so the class divide, and in particular focuses on what life was like in some of the very poorest areas of London.